Desmond 101. Welcome back for another episode of Gradius Lore. And this time I'm really excited to talk to you about Gradius II. Personally, my favorite entry in the series. And today you'll find out why. This was a game that I didn't know about for the longest time. I had played Gradius III in the first game, but this one was mostly unknown to me until a few years back. So it kind of started and reinvigorated my interest in the series. So let's get started. The hype at Konami in 1987 into 1988 was very real. They were on a hot streak with games like Contra, Life Force, and lesser-known titles like Ajax, making waves in the arcades. They had assembled a crack team of shooting game fans, along with top visual and audio talent, and even help from team members on other Konami projects, for a true sequel to Gradius. Previously, there had been some internal discussion about Life Force and Salamander being called Gradius II, but it was ultimately decided against. Hiroyasu Machiguchi of the first Gradius was back directing the second, and they pulled off an amazing feat by creating arguably one of the finest games in the entire series in a mere 5 months' time. This was due to a very focused and highly skilled team of relatively small size working closely and feeling inspired. The ideas were rolling in fast. How to make this game a proper sequel with enough influence from the original while building on new concepts and taking what they learned from Salamander and Life Force. This game would be a masterclass of design and refinement of shooting game mechanics, fed by the fans who pumped quarters into the previous arcade machines. The Gradius and Salamander games had a reputation of being smart, stylish, and serious titles. It really shows how much they carried this quality into the final product. There is a degree of randomness to the calculating enemy AI, and it all really pulls the player in, wanting to figure out the secrets to its complex arrangement. The developers noted how people play the game and added things to throw the player off. The team developed the stages in order of how the ideas came together, the first being the Volcano and Moai stages. Released in March of 1988, Gradius II was a hit in Japanese arcades. The magazine Game Machine had it in the number 2 spot for most popular arcade games the month after its March debut, and it remained in the top 20 list for the rest of that year. The game had enough of the original to bring in the fans, and added just the right amount of innovation to improve the game in just about all areas over the original, bringing in a host of new players. The full title is Gradius II, Gofer no Yabo, or the translation is Gradius II, Gofer's Ambition, a reference to the main antagonist of the game. The arcade game also got released in European territories as Vulcan Venture that same year, with slight changes such as the names of power-ups matching the names used in early version of Life Force. Ripple Laser is called the Pulse Laser. You also have the ability to continue. In a sad twist of fate, Gradius II was never released here in the States, for both the arcade and the ports, until 2006 with the Gradius Collection on PSP. More on these versions later. The story is short and sweet, leaving more to the imagination of the player as they complete the game. It takes place 2 years after the original Gradius, and once again the Bacterians are sent to attack Planet Gradius. But this time they are led by Gofer, a giant brain creature with a face of muscular features without skin, seeming to grow from a large strange biomass. Gradius sends the Vic Viper into battle, and it's not entirely clear whom pilots the ship. We may assume that it is James Burton, though I am not able to confirm this or even guess who it is. The Vic Viper is model BP-8272, one of the most powerful versions of the Vic Viper, as the craft for this mission. Gofer knows how to put up a fight and has recruited some of the previous bosses from Salamander and Life Force to team up with all new bosses and a horde of enemies out to get the Vic Viper. The game is now more geared towards skilled players who would attempt to play the game and complete it for multiple loops. The developers knew this and added differences after beating the last boss. They could then see additional features such as terrain changes to the volcano stage upon the second loop of the game. This was to appeal to the hardcore player base who craved an exceedingly high level of challenge. In the game, the announcer returns, not speaking as much as in the Life Force arcade, but he still calls up power-ups as you activate them, and he will also tell you that you need more practice when you get a game over for the first half of the game.
You need some practice.
In the latter half, you hear the laugh of Gofer taunting you instead. The game can seem impossible at many spots if you die, particularly in the later stages, and this would enforce a trend of what many refer to as Gradius syndrome, meaning the player is overpowered with their power-up bar maxed out, but if you happen to die, it's sometimes unlikely that you can recover from it at certain spots, forcing the player to start over from the beginning. A player really needs to practice and play the game a lot to figure out how to complete it without dying or on minimal lives lost, though it's not entirely unfair, striking a sweet spot of balance. Weapon loadout now has different varieties you can select from, which has now become a staple of the series. It was this feature that really led into the distinction of different craft of the Vic Viper. New items include a powerful spread bomb, a photon torpedo that can pierce armor, moving through multiple enemies until it hits a barrier. Double shot is either an angled shot like in the first game or front and back fire. The player can now select between either a force field that covers the entire ship or the original shield that blocks only the front. I should also mention the music at this point, which ups the level of catchy and intense energy right from the beginning of the game, and it carries that same energy throughout the game, making very certain that Gradius games were to be known for their stellar soundtracks, on par with the art style and look of the games. The game begins in a dramatic stage called Artificial Sun, with a field of small floating suns that emanate fire dragons that will chase you, along with some other smaller enemies. The stage scrolls both vertical and horizontal like a Moai stage. At the end awaits the Fire Phoenix, a large firebird that needs to be shot in the head to defeat it. The Fire Phoenix shows up again in Nemesis II and is parodied in Parodius. The second stage, called simply Alien, we get a wonderful mix of the design of aliens from H.R. Giger, and a little Contra thrown in there too with the spider-like creatures that look straight out of the final boss fight of that game. The boss of the second stage is the Big Eye, a rather simple boss that fires off a ton of shots from its tentacles and fires a larger boulder from the eye. We never see this boss again in another Gradius game, but he is in the anime. In the third level, Crystal is filled with, you guessed it, giant crystals that are breakable, while some are indestructible, and the player must avoid getting hit by them while taking care of enemies. You will find Crystal Core at the end of this level, and it's another core-type boss that can block your shots with its arms protruding out front. Crystal Core shows up again in Gradius III and Gradius Gaiden, as well as many of the Parodius games. Following this is the Volcano stage, which is a classic Gradius theme. This level presents some tricky enemy placement that can end your turn if you are not careful. The boss of Volcano is Death MK2, an update from Death from Salamander. Here he uses the large laser attack for his second phase, which would be associated with his later appearance in Gradius III and Gradius Gaiden. The Revenge of Moai stage is next, with the same layout as the first game, but now with more aggressive Moai that will turn red later in the stage. These Moai can attack faster and even move to change direction or sit up from a laying position. There is a mini-boss at the end, which is some large jumping Moai heads, similar to the last level of Salamander. Big Moai is after these, which is a wall with 3 giant Moai embedded that shoot out smaller Moai, which will fire tiny rings at the Vic Viper. We see the Big Moai once more in Gradius Galaxies on the Game Boy Advance. The high-speed maze is a new theme that becomes a series staple. Here, Vic Viper flies through a mechanical interior with large steep angled corridors at a high speed, trying not to hit a dead end or closing gateway. Make sure to have a few speed-ups selected. Big Core MK2 makes its debut here, an evolution of the Big Core and a favorite design amongst Gradius fans. It shows up in Gradius 3 and 5 as well as referenced in other Konami games and Yu-Gi-Oh! Following after this is the Boss Rush stage, which begins with a familiar Zub Rush, where you can power up the Vic Viper to prepare for multiple boss fights in a row. This is another stage theme that became a staple, not only for Gradius, and this is certainly an early pioneer of this sometimes hated trend, along with games like Space Harrier, Mega Man, and Fantasy Zone 2. First, the original Big Core returns for a rematch, though it's a pushover still. Then you take on Golem from Salamander, who is handled the same way as before. Next, it's Tetran, another boss from Salamander, who starts to up the challenge a bit with those faster moving arms that might catch you off guard. Gaw will follow up Tetran, and fights similar from the death fight earlier in the game with 2 phases. Intruder is the second to last boss of the rush, who is pretty straightforward, and the same as he was in Salamander. Watch out when he splits into 3 smaller dragons. The boss rush ends with Covered Core, who can be daunting if you are not familiar with the indestructible missile patterns that he fires. Just make sure to fire when it's vulnerable as its armor is rotating. Covered Core will show up again in Gradius 3, Gaiden, and a Parodius game. The Vic Viper can now enter Gofer's ship interior at this point, the final stage of the game. It is the return of the base stage from the first game, complete with tons of enemies in hard-to-reach spots and unexpected attacks from the terrain. 3 bosses are within. First is Demos, a type of gun wall making its debut in the Gradius series. Then you must face the iconic Invincible Crab, aka Shadow Dancer as it has been come to be known. This boss has to be avoided and it will simply let you pass after you navigate around it for long enough. Just be sure to watch out for the duckers piling up and filling the screen with bullets. This version of Crab Walker doesn't show up in other games in the series. However, we see new versions of the Shadow Dancer called Shadow Gear and Shadow Gear MK2, along with other designs based on the same idea in many of the games in the series. Definitely a favorite of mine. There was just something so cool about this boss and its forms. It could be argued to be the true last boss fight of this game. Though, the final last boss is of course the titular Gofer, whom the developers named as a reference to an assistant on a movie set, someone who is tasked with miscellaneous jobs to help out the cast and crew on the shoot. Like the brain from the end of the first Gradius, Gofer is defenseless and will start by saying, "I am the strongest," and once defeated he states, "I am just a small portion of the Empire Bacterian," before he dies in an explosion. It's not clear if Gofer is a creation of Bacterian or a separate being, but Gofer can command the Bacterian, and he is capable of regenerating from fragments of himself if he is destroyed. Gofer returns in Gradius 4, as well as an MSX game called Nemesis 3 Eve of Destruction, aka Gofer no Yabo Episode 2. And that leads us to a very important note on the MSX. There was another Gradius II for this system. It beat the arcade Gradius II to release the previous year in 1987. In a move that actually helps clear up the naming confusion, it was also called Nemesis 2 in European releases, and it never saw release here in the States. This earlier Gradius II is a completely different game, denoted by the use of an alphanumeric 2 in the title instead of Roman numerals. Much like the MSX version of Salamander, this game takes great liberty with expounding upon a large complex story that is simply too much to cover for this video. But I will give a brief overview for the sake of completeness. The story begins in the year 66-64 and revolves around Dr. Venom, who was mentioned in Gradius Lore Episode 1. Dr. Venom plans and attempts a coup d'etat against Emperor Lars XVII, whom exiles him to planet Sard when Venom's plans are foiled. Dr. Venom escapes and leads an attack to Gradius in the year 66-66, and James Burton once again rides into battle, this time in the new Metallion fighter, an important ship to the series. The game was made by a different team from the arcade Gradius II and was designed by Naoki Matsui of Metal Slave fame, who worked on other MSX games such as Space Manbo and was friends with Hideo Kojima, whom he helped get Metal Gear series greenlit for development, among a slew of other credits including work on Snatcher. The game features the ability to add new weapons to the Metallion. To do this, you must fly into the bosses after they are defeated in less than 30 seconds, and then make it through a small stage to acquire the upgrade. There is also new special power-ups that only work for a limited time. The game has 15 stages in total. Many new boss types make appearances here, and the challenge is again very high. There is different endings like Salamander on MSX, and you can affect the game by putting different Konami games into the second cartridge slot on the system. This game got ported to the X68000 computer as Nemesis 90 Kai with updated graphics that match arcade quality. It also got ported to the PSP in the Salamander Portable Collection with improved scrolling up from the MSX version. You can also find this game on the Konami Antiques Collection for Saturn and PS1. For the ports of the arcade Gradius II, the first was on the Famicom, released in December of 1988. Sporting a special VRC4 memory mapper chip, this game pushed the console and added voices, the ability to equip 4 options at once, and more. This is likely one of the reasons Konami didn't bring the game to the West, since they couldn't make custom chipsets for NES releases, and they weren't keen on writing a new version to work on the NES like Castlevania 3 ended up having done. Gradius II for Famicom is also a game that is not compatible with most clone NES consoles due to the special chipset. This version is surprisingly faithful to the original game, with minor changes such as levels and bosses as well as musical differences. The first 2 stages are the same, however, the second half of the first stage is full of giant solar flares that are reminiscent of Life Force. In the second stage, Giga from Salamander shows up as an extra boss after the Big Eye. Volcano stage is next instead, and it flows directly into the Crystal stage without fighting Death MK2. The Moai stage is after this, and then goes into the boss rush for stage 6. The enemy base is stage 7, which combines the fortress and speed zone stages, and ends with the crab fight. But now you can destroy the crab by shooting it in the middle. Then finally, the last stage takes you into the lair of Gofer, which resembles a harder version of the first level of Salamander, full of biostructures and amoeba-like enemies, with Gofer at the end. He can actually attack you here, although it's still very easy. Instead of saying he is the strongest, he actually repeats the power-up announcement names in a very slowed down pitch, for a creepy effect. Overall, the game is much more manageable for players compared to the standard arcade difficulty, so this game is recommended for players new to the series. In 1992, there was a port to the PC Engine CD that includes a new level after the Moai stage, called Temple, with a desert theme, and it ends with a new boss, Desert Core, which only shows up here, but a similar looking boss does show up in Gradius Gaiden. This port is otherwise very faithful to the arcade, perhaps a bit easier, and it was originally planned for a North America release, but was eventually cancelled. It was included in the recent TurboGrafx 16 mini console. That is how I captured the footage for this video. It includes some gorgeous introduction cutscenes with the Vic Viper. Another port that same year was released for the X68000 and is again a very close port to the arcade original, like most arcade ports on this fantastic computer. Gradius III would soon follow in 1989. It is likely that many are familiar with the Gradius series due to this port of the particular game on the Super Nintendo. However, Gradius III never made quite the same impact as its predecessor. It doesn't do much to improve on the Gradius formula, and it can seem far too difficult for many, and it feels like it was not made with the same level of care as the previous titles. It may have been rushed. It's not to say it's a bad game at all, and the Super Nintendo version is still a classic in its own right. In 1996, the game was also released as part of the Gradius Deluxe Pack on Sega Saturn and PlayStation in Japan. The game features difficulty settings, making it more playable for those who are not accustomed to the high challenge. In 2006, the game finally saw a larger release on the PSP Gradius collection. More recently, it's been available on the PlayStation Store and Virtual Console since 2008, depending on the platform, as well as on the TurboGrafx 16 Mini like I mentioned before. Gradius II remains one of the most influential and defining games in the series. While it is not as well known as Gradius III, it represents a turning point and an entryway for many of us to find out more about how we missed out on some key games in the series. In my own passion for Gradius, this was a big moment for me when I discovered there was a sequel I had not played or heard of between the original and the third game on the Super Nintendo. It began my desire to discover more about the series, to find out exactly how many games were really out there. So I hope this video was helpful in letting you find out more about Gradius II and its story. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you have a good one, and I will see you next time.